All right. So today we are going to talk about punctuation. And this book uses a thing called stop punctuation to kind of help guide us through the different forms that we can use throughout our sentences. So if you have any questions during this time, just raise your hand. If anything's confusing, you let me know. We can help clarify it. But we're going to kind of use the examples they gave in the book to demonstrate the different uses moving forward, just so you know. So a sentence essentially combines two independent clauses and phrases. It's kind of glued together with punctuation. It helps things flow better, tells the reader when to stop, when there's a list of things, as we'll see with apostrophes, can show ownership, things like that. So it's just kind of a guide throughout writing and reading to make it make more sense. So after this lesson, you should be able to know the different types of punctuation and how to apply them. So again, with the stop punctuation, we'll start with the period. So that's when you have two independent clauses and you just make them essentially two different sentences, two different ideas. So like your book says, it's got that run-on sentence initially where it's the band known as U2 was formed in 1976. Their original name was Feedback. It runs on, it's two separate ideas that need something there to kind of break it up. So with the period, you put the period right in between them and make them two different sentences. The semicolon's very similar. It pretty much is the same thing. It's just this little guy over here. Instead of making them two different, you keep it all in one and use that to separate them. And then lastly, we have this acronym FANBOYS. So it stands for the different words you see here. So for, and, not, but, or, yet, and so. And you can throw those in the middle of the clauses to have a break for the reader as well and make it make more sense. So the example, they use and, or they use but. So the band, now known as U2, was formed in 1976, comma, but the original name was Feedback. So yeah, all of these help with two independent clauses when you have two sentences or when you have two ideas that could stand on their own, but you want to combine them or separate them with the period. So now we're going to go into a few different other kinds of punctuation, starting with the comma, probably the one you're going to be using the most throughout your writing. So a comma is just like the period is like the red light, you completely stop. The comma is like a flashing yellow light. It's going to tell the reader to slow down and take a pause before moving on to the next part of the idea. So there's four different instances where you would use one. The first being an introductory phase. Does anybody know what an introductory phase is?
It's like what you use before or at the beginning of a sentence, like you say after, comma, or next.
Right, it kind of
an idea.
Right, it introduces what you're going to be talking about in the next part of the sentence. It gives some kind of background information. So in the example they gave you there, originally influenced by punk rock bands, comma, the members of U2 believed the music proficiency was not necessarily required to be successful. So like it says, the introduction idea, it helps give you a better insight into what the next part of the sentence is. It's like background information. Whereas the next part where you'll be using commas are before and after unnecessary info. So you had a good explanation of that earlier.
Yeah, I was just saying it's just, you don't really need it in the sentence,
Right.
you just, but
Kind
it's
of
just extra info
Right.
to get the reader's attention more.
Right, like it paints a better picture, but you wouldn't necessarily need it to be a part of the sentence for the sentence to still make sense. Whereas like this is kind of necessary for you to understand. This is kind of just like you're making it more interesting, you're adding some stuff, and they give an example below. Does everyone get those two before we move on? Okay, so this one is probably the most self-explanatory. When you have a list in a sentence, you want to separate them with commas to show the reader that it is a list. And you want to take notice that we bring in a lot of times these fanboy words in the list, and you have a comma right up until you use this one. So that's the list. And then lastly, when you have a list of just two things, you want to separate with a comma. This is typically going to be with like adjectives. So if you're describing something, I think they give in here looser, funkier drum tracks. It just kind of helps differentiate between the two describing words and break up the sentence a little bit. So when you have a list of multiple, you use them, and you incorporate one of those fanboy words, and then when you just have a list of two things, you want to stick one in there as well. So those are commas. They help with the pauses in our sentences. And now we have colons and dashes. These are kind of what they look like, if you didn't know. So these are less common, obviously, than commas. We don't use them quite as much. And they must be preceded or come before an independent clause. So again, one of those sentences that could stand on its own. You want to have one of those before it. So I think they give you some examples. It's easier just to kind of see it in your book. Yeah, so U2 has done collaborations with many well-known bands, and I can't really read that word.
Artists.
Thank you, artists. And then they use the comma to show that they're introducing who those artists are in the sentence. And it's the same thing with the dash. They're kind of interchangeable. If you prefer the dash, you could use that in there as well. So does anybody have questions about those? Are kind of confusing. I feel like you're not going to use them as much, but they're good to know when you see them, or if you ever feel like utilizing them in your own writing. No?
Nope.
Okay, so we'll move on to apostrophes. These are really good to know because you're going to be using these a lot with your writing and reading. So there are two uses, one to show possession and two for contractions. So I think we'll start with contractions. Does anybody know what a contraction is?
It's like two separate words combined into one. Like you could say, I don't even know. I can't
like
think of an
didn't
example right now. Yeah,
like
there you go.
Did not, and you combine them.
Yep.
So it's just a way to, again, make writing kind of flow a little bit easier sometimes. Sometimes when you break them up, it sounds a little bit choppier. So the only thing to keep in mind with contractions are words like, you got to know when to use it. Like words like it's, it is, and it's not always going to be it is. Do you know what I'm saying? Like when you say it's Monday, obviously it is Monday. But if you were to say something like, I think they give a good example in here. Well, I can't find it right now, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I know.
So if you're
I was trying to
ever,
think of an example too.
if you're ever unsure if it's a contraction or not, just separate it into the two words, and if it doesn't make sense, you don't need it. So lastly, we can use apostrophes to show possession.
Okay. I'm sorry, Trisha.
So, with showing possession, when you have the ownership of a noun, so for example, like Kelsey's room,
Yeah.
you would place an apostrophe before the S to show that it is, she's in ownership of the noun, which is the room. One of the tricks here that can mess people up is if the word already ends in an S, you don't want to have a double S thing going on like children's. You're not going to put children's, that sounds weird. You would just put the apostrophe right after the S to show, again, the ownership, but without making it look funky with two S's. So does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, if you just kind of think back to the stop punctuation and use our analogies with our red lights and our flashing yellow lights, you should be good to go with your writing and reading for the ACTs.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.